stone began to rise into the air. The men also had ropes attached to help lift and angle it correctly. They all took the strain, keeping the stone steady and guiding it as it ascended. With much shouting and pulling, the men bravely tackled the heavy load, and the lintel was carefully, slowly, and precisely placed upon the stones. When it landed in place, a satisfying thud echoed around the space. For a moment, dead silence hushed around the men, as everyone held their breath and hoped the stones would hold the weight, followed by a stammer of relieved applause when the monolith stood firm. The men then began to walk around the stones, talking and chattering excitedly to each other, marvelling at what they had achieved. "Well, it's a marvellous sight," Simon conceded, finding Drew and the inspector with Dr. Sampson. "There's no doubt that it should have been put right. My apologies for my interference, gentlemen." He was humbled to have been present at such a prestigious occurrence, and embarrassed by his behaviour. "Oh, no bother, Simon." Sampson waved his apology away. "Your heart was in the right place." "Indeed," the inspector agreed. "It takes a brave man to stand up for what he believes in the face of such opposition. I applaud you for it." Simon was pleased to have the inspector's blessing, and to have been part of the day's activity. "If you're all right, Inspector, we'll remove the scaffold now," one of the brothers approached and asked. "Yes, of course. I cannot thank you enough for your help," the inspector replied gratefully. "Oh, not at all, Inspector. Historic moment like this. Glad we were part of it," he informed him. "I'll drop the bill into Firestone Police Station, as you said." "Of course, and they will forward it to me," he told Drew, who nodded in understanding. The brothers made their way to the stones through the throng of people to the carefully constructed frame to begin dismantling it. The army men began lending a hand, and before long their truck was once more laden with metal poles. They then set off back to the roundabout to collect the last of their poles from the hole so they could carry on with Ernie's roof. By now the sun was beginning to set. The sky was muddying behind the thick cloud. A spatter of rain began to fall icy and hard onto the crowd, and this seemed to be the last straw. The men all resigned to leaving the stones behind and began to slowly trickle away from the clearing and towards the town, gravitating towards the Green Man. The inspector and Drew followed them out of the area and down the path. "So, now do we look for the missing men?" Drew asked, wondering what the next step would be. "Not quite," the inspector informed him. "We must return tonight and watch the stones. If I am right, the men will come and find us." Drew replied with a puzzled look, which the ever-observant inspector noticed. "Come and have some dinner, I shall explain," the inspector advised. "Only one more night to keep watch, chaps," the inspector called to the policemen on guard merrily as they passed. "Oh, really?" one replied, relieved, though a little confused. They watched the crowds dispersing. "Yes, and you'll have some company tonight. A couple of ambulances will be sat here with you while Drew and I search the woods for the missing men." "You're going out looking for them tonight?" the other asked, not quite believing what he was hearing. Darkness hovered over them perilously. A splatter of rain lashed them, and the cold bit a little deeper. "Do you really think you'll find them, then?" "Well, let's hope so," the inspector replied, rather confidently. They made their way back to Drew's car and drove quickly to the Green Man. They entered to find it bursting at the seams with excited and slightly drunk townspeople. At the sight of the inspector, a cheer erupted. "It would appear that you are some kind of hero," Drew called to him over the applause that followed. The inspector began shaking the hands that were thrust at him as he fought his way to the bar. "Whatever for?" he asked them all, though Drew was the only one listening. "For moving the stone. It was a dark piece of our history for a long time. You burst into the town and it's moved in a week. And you discovered the stones to boot," Drew informed him. "I'm just doing my job," he informed them all modestly, refusing the pint of beer that someone was trying to push into his hand. "Oh, not for me, not while on duty." He brushed the brimming glass away politely. "I'll have a cup of tea though, please, Mavis, and 2 lamb roasts when you're ready. Perhaps we'll eat in my room, Drew," he suggested over the ruckus. Chapter 94. Drew and the inspector made their way up to the inspector's room, where the inspector immediately began tidying away his things to make space on the dresser so Drew could put the pot of tea down. "The lamb here really is delicious," the inspector said over his shoulder as he filled drawers with folders of paperwork. The first thing Drew noticed on entering the room was the odour of developing fluid. "And it's all local, probably from old Benson's farm between here and Grantham," Drew replied, entertaining the small talk. "So what should I expect tonight?" he asked. "Are we going into the woods?" With the dresser cleared, he could put the tray of the tea things down, and the inspector immediately began to pour 2 cups. Drew stood by the window and looked out upon the swaying of the trees behind the dim rooftops. "No, I do not wish to enter those trees again," the inspector replied. "We shall be sitting comfortably in your car." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "Here, look at these," he suggested. "More photographs?" Drew asked, picking up the folder. "Yes, taken over the last couple of days." Drew opened it up and took them out. The first was a view of the trees from the stones. At first glance it seemed a rather dull photograph, but as Drew looked closer he saw to one side was a dark shape of a man, like a tall shadow, half exposed, half empty. Drew studied it carefully. "What is it?" Drew asked. "That is what I am not sure of, but there are more." Drew continued to look through, and on each picture a vague shape appeared. "It looks like the missing men," Drew informed him after close examination. "I don't understand," he admitted. "How did you take these?" "Just with my ordinary camera," the inspector replied. "I I also developed these. He opened a second folder and passed the photographs to Drew. These were taken by the archaeologists. Drew sat quietly for a few moments and studied the photographs. "Sorry, Inspector, what am I looking for?" he asked, unable to see the relevance. "Exactly. The strange shapes only appear on the photographs I took. I think it means that the men are trying to contact me, to tell me something." He looked at the photographs from his camera again. "I hope it means we are doing the right thing, and that replacing the lintel will bring them back," the inspector informed him just as there was a knock at the door. "Room service!" came a friendly call from behind it. Drew pushed the photographs back into the folder, and the inspector stood and let Mavis in. "Thank you, Mavis, I do appreciate it," the inspector welcomed her warmly. Drew moved the tea tray so that she could put their dinners down in its place on the dresser. "Oh, not a problem, Inspector. I don't blame you wanting to come up here and get some peace." She bustled her way in and put the dinners down. She instinctively grabbed Drew's tea tray from him. "Enjoy, gentlemen," she called to them as she flurried out again. "Oh, Mavis, before you go—" She stopped in her tracks and spun round. "Yes, Inspector?" she asked, eager to please. "This may seem a little odd, but I was wondering if I could borrow some mirrors from you." She thought for a moment, not sure how to react. "Mirrors, Inspector? Whatever for?" she asked, rather confused. "Oh, it is just part of the investigation," he told her vaguely. "Which ones? The ones in the bathroom?" she asked, glancing anxiously round the doorway at the strange-smelling red room. "Yes, and one from the bar, if possible. You won't even notice that they're missing. All will be returned before you awake in the morning." "Well, all right then," she replied. "Just be careful with them." She bustled away again, leaving the men to their food. They perched on the end of the bed, facing their dinner on the dresser, and the makeshift arrangement sufficed as a dining table. They began to eat. After a few mouthfuls, the inspector paused to take a sip of tea. "So, do you have a theory around where the men are, about what is happening in Firestone?" Drew asked, though he wasn't sure if he would understand the answer. "Well, Drew, the best theory I can formulate, with the evidence I have obtained, is that Firestone seems to be attracting energy sources in many different forms, like the increased magnetism and the lower pressure, but also energy in forms that we have only theorized about before. Whether this is because of the stones, I know not. It could be that they are in some way emanating this energy, or it could be that the stone circle was built there because the early residents were aware of the energy that surrounds this area and constructed the circle as some kind of monument to it. Either way, the energy and the stones are now connected. The energy itself was being used as a pathway across a myriad of dimensions by other energy forms." He paused for a sip of tea and a mouthful of food. "Then, as we know, the energy was rediscovered a few hundred years ago, and the townspeople destroyed the stone circle in fear, in an attempt to eradicate the energy. In doing so, they managed to cause a blockage that trapped these energy forms in the trees." Drew could barely believe what he was being told. It all sounded too fantastic. "On the most part, the energy became lost in the trees. However, I think that some of the energy that became trapped in the trees made the leap from tree to man, and it has been inhabiting the bodies of the men that were at the mayor's house for decades, perhaps even inhabiting their fathers before them. My best guess is that they found a way into the bodies in an attempt to reopen the blockage, but something went wrong, or they found themselves unable to do anything, and so they have been trapped in the bodies of men ever since. Where the others lived quiet lives, eking out an existence through the generations, I think something went awry with the Banks line. They somehow became able to use the beings that had possessed them, exploiting them to build up power and influence, and using that influence to continue to keep the secret of Firestone hidden, hiding the stones and stopping them from being repaired. That is why your father died. That is why others have died in the past at the hand of the Banks family. As people discovered the secret, they were silenced." Drew nodded, dumbfounded. "I expect that when it gets dark enough, whatever the energy is that inhabits those bodies will make their way to the stones and travel through them back along the unblocked path, open now that the Firestone is back in place. There are likely to be other 347s that inhabit the trees, and I am hoping we might see more of these life forms through the mirrors." He glanced nervously out of the window at the rapidly encroaching darkness. "Time moves on," he said, swallowing a mouthful of potato. Drew had stopped eating while the inspector had been explaining his theory. Both men now tucked into their meals, the explanation rolling around in their heads. The inspector had been purposefully honest with Drew. He had wanted him to hear the full theory, but knew he would need time to digest the information. When they had finished their food, they relaxed as best they could on the bed. "How does all that sound to you, Drew?" the inspector asked, interested to hear what he thought. Drew sat back on the bed, looking out of the window. "If it had come from anyone else, I might have thought them mad, but over the last week I have seen some strange things. I would never have believed it if I hadn't been with you throughout your investigation," he admitted. The inspector smiled. "Luckily, I have enough evidence to back up the theory, but we are yet to see it in practice. That is, I hope, what we will be witnessing tonight. Let's grab those mirrors and head up to the stones," the inspector said excitedly, heading into the bathroom. Drew stood and put on his coat. "Does Mavis not mind you transforming her bathroom into a developing room?" he asked. "She hasn't mentioned it," the inspector replied, lifting a mirror off the wall and not understanding why it might be of any inconvenience. Drew grabbed a second smaller mirror from over the sink and they headed out of the door. They fought their way through the crowd, who helpfully carried the third mirror out to the police car for them. They laid them carefully in the boot and the back seat, then headed off up the hill. Chapter 95. The approach to the stones was dark, and all around them the trees swung about in the wind and rain in defiance of what they had witnessed that day. As they approached the entrance to the woods, Drew's headlights picked out 2 ambulances parked at the side of the road. "Ah, the ambulances are here already," the inspector said with surprise. Drew piloted the car up to the police line, and one of his colleagues jumped out of their car and into the cold night. He pulled the tape back and allowed them through. Drew and the inspector gave a wave of thanks and headed up towards the stones. "Do you think you could turn the car around?" the inspector asked, looking about the space in the dark evening. "Probably," Drew replied, beginning a tricky manoeuvre in the odd corner of wood that he found himself in. He managed to squeeze the car around, so they faced back down the newly gravelled path towards the road. The inspector fetched the mirrors from the back seat and set them up on the dashboard in front of them, blocking their view forward. "So what are we looking for?" Drew asked, staring into the dark behind them at the stones reflected in the mirrors. The inspector peered carefully at the newly replaced Firestone, and as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw what he was hoping for. "There, it's beginning already." The inspector pointed at the space between the stones, and sure enough, a dim light had begun to illuminate the air. Drew turned around quickly and glanced about the dark space that surrounded the stones. "I can only see it in the mirror." "Like the eyes on the night I discovered the body," Drew realised. The inspector nodded. "We must watch carefully for the men. I'm not sure how long it will take them to appear." As they watched, the light between the stones slowly grew brighter, illuminating the space around the stones. Soon the night was darkest black around them, but the light shone through it, brighter than white. The glare shone around the space, illuminating shapes, picking out things that were ordinarily invisible in the darkness. From the trees came a waft of fog, a light whiff of vapour that caught the light and reflected the spectrum through it and out amongst the trees. The vapour paused, circling round and moving about the stones, studying the light. Drew and the inspector watched open-mouthed. "And a visitor from another plane, another dimension," the inspector whispered to Drew as if he might startle it at any moment. "Stranded by the blockage. It must depend on low-frequency light waves for its means of travel. The inspector took a few photographs of it in the mirror as it wafted around the space. It then shot through the stones, vanishing between them. "Very interesting," he mused to himself. He checked his watch and studied a few instruments. He then noted it all down in his notebook. Drew sat and watched the reflection of the invisible scene behind him, mesmerised. Soon after, another shape shifted itself out of the trees. It was black and flat, and was only visible because of its contrast against the white of the light. It moved like a square wheel, its sides flexing, shrinking and growing as it rotated. The shape headed straight for the light emanating from the gap without hesitation, like a scared rodent darting for safety. It was gone before the inspector had a chance to get his camera to it, but he scribbled the time and a description down in his notebook. As the darkness of night sunk deeper into black, the light between the stones grew even brighter, as if drawing its energy from the dark. It illuminated the view of the woods around them in the mirror, revealing lost visitors hiding between the trunks. All had been washed up in the woods around Firestone when the circle had been destroyed. When the sky reached its darkest at around 3 in the morning, the shapes that flowed through the light and between the stones were indistinguishable from each other. An endless stream of startling shapes darted through wisping smoke trails and slipped through a spectrum of wavelengths as the life forms skipped through space and light before disappearing through the stones back on their way to their own dimensions. The trees too were affected by it. They were shrinking, thinning, losing energy. As the energy dissipated, so the readings on the inspector's instruments slowly faded. He checked them regularly all night, carefully noting down every change in them. The spectacle was like nothing Drew could ever imagine. Creatures he could barely comprehend were flitting past behind his head. It was like watching dreams being formed, being dreamt, and being released. The shapes hurried past for a while, but suddenly their course slowed and they began coming indeterminately, until through the trees and into the light came floating shapes that Drew was more familiar with. They moved sideways, side by side to the trunks, burning above all other shapes. The eyes were powerful and piercing. They stopped in their tracks in the clearing and stared into the mirrors and straight into Drew and the inspector's eyes. The men stopped in shock. For a moment, everything slowed down. The light paused in its flow, hanging trails in mid-air. The eyes stared at them and they were caught in the piercing glare that penetrated through the night. Then the eyes were on them and in them, and they were a part of them, and all of the mysterious lifeforms that were passing by. They could feel and know and see all the explicit and unending gratitude that the beings felt for the release that was finally theirs. And then the eyes released them, their message delivered, and they moved on through the stones and on their way. The light returned around them, and time resumed a direction and speed they were more accustomed to. For a moment, the two men were motionless, as their minds raced to comprehend what had happened. Before they could move or speak or even blink, another disturbance came from beyond their field of vision. This one was much more solid and human. The body of Atkins crashed abruptly out from the trunks, tripping and falling onto his face, then springing unnaturally back up again. Drew jumped from the car and the inspector called him back. "Drew, not yet. Let me go through the stones." Drew looked out into the trees to try to spot his friend and colleague, but all about the trees were dark. The area remained deserted, just as it had been when they arrived, blanketed in an insidious night. He climbed back into the car to continue his vigil by the mirror. Now he saw where Atkins stood, twitching and convulsing in the light of the stones. He then limped, leapt, and finally sprinted his way at the stones, leaping through them head first, and, to the relief of the inspector and Drew, shooting straight through to the other side as one might expect. They looked into the mirror at the body of Atkins, lying motionless on the cold, wet ground. "Right, let's go," the inspector yelled and leapt out of the car. He and Drew sprinted over to Atkins and found him laying face down in the mud. They rolled him onto his side and the inspector checked his pulse. "He's still alive," he cried, enjoyed. "Do you think you could get him down to the ambulance?" "Yes, I'll give him a fireman's lift," Drew replied. "I'll stay here in case any of the others appear," the inspector said. With a little struggle they managed to get him upright and onto Drew's shoulders, who carefully carried him down the path towards the ambulance. The inspector returned to the car and continued the vigil. After a while Drew returned, this time with one of the folding beds from the ambulance. "I thought this might make our lives a bit easier," Drew told him. "Good thinking, Drew," the inspector replied with a nod. "How are things down the road?" "Quiet, thankfully," Drew replied, climbing back into the driver's seat. "We don't seem to be attracting any attention from the townspeople. Probably a bit late for them to notice anything." "Good. And the men? In good spirits?" "All fine. They have set themselves up in the back of one of the ambulances and were playing cards and drinking coffee. It looked like Andy was winning. They were surprised to see me appear with Atkins. They gave him the once-over and he seemed to be fine, but dehydrated. They asked if they should take him back to the hospital, but I asked them to wait," Drew asked, checking he had done the right thing. "Good. The rest of the men should start appearing now we have the gateway reopened. We want them all taken to the hospital together if we can." As if on cue, another disturbance came crashing through the trees from behind them, and the shape of a man appeared in their mirror. "Who's this?" the inspector asked, peering through the darkness. The figure lurched and limped over to the stones, and upon reaching them stopped, then fell through them. They raced over and discovered the mayor, his pyjamas torn and ripped. His breathing was heavy and wheezing, but he seemed all right otherwise. They lifted him onto the trolley, and Drew raced him down to the ambulance. Drew returned with his trolley within 10 minutes to find Charlie had reappeared. They loaded his unconscious body onto the trolley. "Perhaps we should get these three to the hospital now. We shouldn't keep them for medical help for too long. I've arranged for them to have their own ward, so they should all be together at the hospital." "Right you are, Inspector," Drew replied and raced off. A few moments later the blue light of the first ambulance began spinning, and with a roar of its engine it sped off towards Nettlewood. Drew returned to his seat and they continued to watch the invisible lights in the mirror, hypnotised by its beauty for a few minutes, before the sound of breaking branches through the trees once more announced the arrival of another of the missing men. The body leapt awkwardly through the stones, and the two policemen raced to his side with the trolley, pushed awkwardly on the new-laid stone path. The body of Dr. Sparrow lay dirty and sweating in the mud, and without needing to discuss what was needed, they lifted him onto the trolley, and Drew raced him down to the ambulance. "Now we just have to wait for Banks," the inspector informed Drew when he returned, and they settled back into their dark vigil. The night crept on, and as morning hesitantly broke over the trees, the ebb of light slowly dissipated and began to flurry like a rainbow of snow in the wind. From the trees suddenly emerged the stumbling body of Banks. "Here he is at last," Drew yelled. In the dim morning light they could just see that his clothes were torn and caked in mud, his face gaunt and ill. They watched Banks walk to the centre of the circle, the flow of light circling and enveloping him. He appeared to be resisting. Where the other men had positively rushed for the stones, Banks fought the urge, and the eerie mist seemed to be coaxing him into the light. Slowly, painfully, he was pushed, pulled, and otherwise forced along, until finally he made his way into the stones, and after a fight he was through. Drew and the inspector jumped out of the car and rushed over, but Banks had not appeared on the other side. They walked around the stones again and again, waiting in case he suddenly reappeared, and after a long wait, it became obvious that he was not going to appear, and they returned to their car. "Sorry, I don't understand," Drew admitted. "Where is he?" "He could be anywhere," the inspector informed him rather downheartedly. "He might not appear ever again, or perhaps he will appear somewhere around here, in the same way that the other bodies have appeared, or perhaps he has already reappeared at some point in the past, and his remains sit amongst those we found in his garage or in the manor house," the inspector replied. But why did he not just pass through the stones like the others? Drew asked. My best guess, and I have nothing more than guesswork to go on here, I'm afraid, is that his mind and that of the energy that he hosted were too intermingled, too closely attached to be separated. When he passed through the stones, the life form was unable to leave, so he had to take Banks through with him. What his fate will be, I'm afraid we may never know. The two men lapsed into thought and watched the last few drifts of mist evaporate through the stones before the sun broke over the horizon and they vanished. Well, I think the show is over, the inspector informed him remorsefully after a few minutes. He removed the mirrors and carefully placed them on the back seat. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Drew admitted. Does this mean the bodies will stop appearing? He asked. Actually, not quite, the inspector advised. There is still a chance that more bodies will appear. Just because we've opened the gateway doesn't mean there won't still be bodies caught in a historic wave that could still appear at some time in the future. There could be none, there could be, well, 100, who knows? The inspector admitted. Let's inform the men at the gate that they can go home, then we can all go and get some well-earned sleep. The inspector yawned. We can meet at the vicarage tomorrow at 3 to inter the remains of our anonymous victims. Drew realised how exhausted he was, and nodded obediently, starting the car and driving them out of the trees. Sunday the 9th of November 1969. Chapter 96. The inspector woke just before noon, keen to get moving following a long rest. He was quickly dressed and downstairs where the Green Man was host to a few regulars and a few new faces examining maps. The excitement of the previous day still hung in the air, despite the reduction in patrons. Afternoon, Inspector. I'd presumed you were out, Mavis greeted him with her usual smile. Would you like your usual breakfast? She asked, checking her watch. Yes, please, the inspector replied simply. And tea, he added. Don't forget the tea. Mavis nodded. As if I could ever forget your tea, she joked, and carried herself off to start cooking. The inspector turned to face the room and found his usual seat was taken, so took a seat nearby and patiently waited for his breakfast, gazing out of the window at the blue sky over Firestone. Shortly Mavis trotted out with a plate of steaming, delicious food and tea. Ah, marvellous, thank you, the inspector beamed. How are you feeling today, then, she asked. Like a new man, thank you, he replied. I was wondering if you might order me a taxi, Mavis. Yes, I can give Dave a ring and see if he's about. Where are you off to? She asked. I need to visit Nettlewood Hospital, but I don't want to disturb Drew. I've put him through rather a lot this last week, and I thought he deserved a day off. Of course, about half an hour, do you think? Give you time to eat your food? That would be ideal, thank you, the inspector told her, and tucked in. He was soon fed and watered, and returned to his room briefly for his hat, coat, and case. He then sat and waited for his taxi, which pulled up and gave a short beep from the pavement. He left the pub and embraced the new day. The fresh air breezed lazily over his face, beating off the unseasonal heat of the high sun. He took a moment to bask under it, allowing the sun to warm his body. He had become accustomed to the cold cloud throwing freezing water at him. It had seemed the sun would never shine in Firestone again. He climbed into the front and Dave welcomed him. Morning. You this inspector everyone's been talking about then, are you? Dave asked with a smile. Guilty as charged. All good things, I hope, the inspector checked. Well, you moved to Firestone, so you've made a few friends there, Dave told him. Hospital, is it? He checked as he pulled away. Yes, please, the inspector replied, and Dave took off. They arrived at the hospital quickly, the Sunday roads bereft of traffic. The hospital car park was a little fuller, with the cars of friends and relatives visiting their loved ones. Inside the hospital, the sound of squeaking shoes on the cold white tiles filled the air. The inspector paid Dave's very reasonable fare, then headed inside. He gave the reception bell a ping, and presently a matron appeared, a little younger and a little less fierce-looking than the lady he had been greeted by during the week. "Hello, can I help you at all?" she asked. "Oh, good afternoon," the inspector welcomed her, removing his hat. "I'm here to visit the missing men who were brought in last night. I believe they were given their own ward." "Oh yes, hello, you must be the inspector. This way, I will take you there myself." She stalked off down the shining corridors, and the inspector followed, close on her heels. The men were situated on the first floor in a quiet corridor. The hospital's occupants that they passed along the way were all relaxing in their beds. Those that weren't trying to entertain guests read under dim lamps or listened to the hospital wireless. The matron delivered him to the door. "Shall I get the nurse to bring in some tea?" she suggested. "I'm sure that would be most appreciated, thank you," the inspector replied. On entering the private ward, the inspector found the mayor to be asleep, but Dr. Sparrow, Atkins, and Charlie had gathered round a bed and were playing cards for matchsticks on the stiff, starchy sheets. "Look, gents, our saviour has arrived," Charlie spoke up for them, and they all turned their heads to look. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Good to see you all looking so well after your ordeal," the inspector enthused as he entered. Even the snoring mayor was looking well. The inspector removed his notepad in readiness for taking notes. They all looked pleased to see him, and Dr. Sparrow pulled a chair over for him. "Thank you." The inspector sat down. "I was wondering if you wouldn't mind answering a few questions about what happened," he asked them. "Well, we can try," Dr. Sparrow told him, "but we've all been asking ourselves and each other the same questions I imagine you are about to ask," he warned him friendlily. "Well, let's begin with what you can remember," the inspector proposed. "Charlie, let's start with you. Talk me through what happened, starting when you woke up on the morning of your disappearance." They turned to the landlord and he shrugged. "I'm really sorry, Inspector, but I really don't know what happened. I remember I had just got out of bed. Must have been about 11 o'clock or so. I had eaten some toast and was thinking about getting the pub ready for opening, but then it all goes blank. Next thing I knew, I was waking up here wondering where the bloody hell I was." "You have no memory of entering the copse or why you went in?" the inspector asked, just as the tea arrived, carried by a busy-looking nurse. "Here you are, gents." She threw the tray down and disappeared again. "Thank you, sister," the inspector called after her and took a swig. She nodded as she hurried out again. "So, Charlie, do you have any idea of what took you into the woods?" "No, I don't," he told him flatly. "We've all been racking our brains trying to work out what happened. It's as though my memory has been wiped, or as if it wasn't remembering while I was out, if that makes sense," he asked. "Because it doesn't really make much sense to me," he added quickly. The inspector nodded, jotting everything down in his notebook. "I see. And, Doctor, are you in the same position? No memory of what happened to you while you were in the copse?" "No, Inspector, I'm afraid not." He shook his head, the worry of the unknown creeping in. "And Constable Atkins, how are you feeling today?" Atkins nodded. "I feel fine, almost like a weight's been lifted. The best I've felt in years," he shook his head. "I can't explain it." "But no memory of what happened? What made you go into the trees, or of what happened while you were in there?" "No, sorry," Atkins said, a little remorseful. "Last thing I remember is walking my beat with Cara." He trailed off suddenly. "Oh my God, Cara! What happened to her?" he cried out in anguish. "Relax, it's fine. I found Cara shortly after you disappeared. She's being cared for by one of your colleagues. I'm sure she will be pleased to see you when you are discharged," the inspector reassured him. Atkins looked relieved. "When will we be discharged?" Dr. Sparrow asked. "We are all feeling fine. Could we not be allowed home now?" he hoped. "I would rather you were kept in for observation for a few days," the inspector explained. "You may be experiencing shock or some other hidden side effects. I want to be sure you are all better. We will also need to run a few tests, take blood samples and the like, to try and see if we can work out what caused your episode." He studied the mayor. "And how's the mayor been?" he asked them. "The same, I presume." "Yes, he's sleeping a lot. He's not generally in good health, but anyway, by all accounts, I think the ordeal has had a greater effect on him," Dr. Sparrow informed him professionally. "But otherwise the same. No memory of what occurred." The inspector jotted a few more things down in his notebook and then finished his tea. "Well, gentlemen, the nurses here will be keeping a close eye on you. Let them know immediately if you have any illness or pain. Should anything come to mind regarding your experience, please let me know immediately via Drew Gates at Firestone Police Station. He will relay the news to me." "Will we ever know what happened?" Atkins asked. "Well, I think it was some kind of fit or paralysis, which could have been brought on by a virus. You were all together at the mayor's house, so there is a good chance you picked it up there. As you may have heard, Banks is still at large, and there is a good chance he was not as lucky as you, and perhaps succumbed to the elements whilst in the copse." "Oh," said Charlie, downheartedly. "Poor old Banks." They all looked rather gloomy for a moment, and the extra bed in their ward that no one had slept in seemed that much emptier. "But we still do have hope that we might appear alive and well. We have people looking for him all over the county. We won't stop looking until we find him, believe me." The men seemed to take some comfort from this. The inspector felt it was best not to mention that if Banks was found, he would be put on trial for the murder of Albert Gates. "Well, gentlemen, the day presses on and I'm afraid I must say goodbye. So glad to have got you home safely, and I hope your recuperation continues," he told them kindly. They all shook his hand and thanked him again before the inspector took his leave and headed back to the reception desk. He exited the hospital and found a lonely taxi waiting in the short rank outside. He climbed into the front passenger seat. The car had cold black leather seats, not unlike Drew's squad car. It stank of cigarette smoke. A haze hovered around it. "Afternoon, where to?" the driver asked with his broad northern lilt. He folded his newspaper up and stashed it on the back seat. "The old farmhouse on the other side of Firestone," the inspector informed him. "Right you are." The car blasted into life and he pulled out. "Nice to have the sun out for a change, isn't it?" the driver asked. "Indeed it is," the inspector agreed with a smile. Chapter 97. The inspector arrived at Mrs. Banks' house and gave a knock on the door. She answered it quickly, and did not look pleased to see the inspector. "Oh, it's you," she said forlornly. It was as though she already knew what the inspector was here to tell her. "Here with more bad news, I suppose. Well, you had better come in." "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, noticing her displeasure at seeing him. "Yes, my son is on his way here with the family for a few days," she told him. "It would be good to have some company." "I'm glad to hear that. How is he handling your father's disappearance?" the inspector asked. She walked into the kitchen and he followed behind. "He seems all right, but you never know with kids, do you? They never seem to want to talk to their parents once they're all grown up." She sniffed into a handkerchief. "I suppose you're here to tell me there's no sign of my husband, and that he probably won't be coming home," she told him as she sat at the table. "Almost right," the inspector replied kindly, sitting down opposite her. "Last night I managed to relocate Dr. Sparrow, Constable Atkins, Charlie, and the mayor. From what I can tell, they had independently gotten lost in the copse, perhaps due to suffering from some illness that they had picked up while at the mayor's. The search for an explanation goes on. They are all recovering from their ordeal in hospital." "But you didn't find my husband?" she asked, tears welling up in her eyes. "No," he told her flatly. "I did see him, briefly, but once again he escaped my clutches." She let out a little sob. "I do apologise. I thought I should let you know the situation myself. I find his ability to elude me quite frustrating," he admitted. "I'm only sad because he keeps getting away," she told him with a sniff. "It's not that I particularly want the sod back again now," she dabbed her eyes. "I just want to see him back safe, whatever happens to him. No doubt he's got himself in all sorts of trouble," she motioned at the inspector. "Well, we will keep looking, and though it is true that there's now no sign of him, there is still hope," he informed her. This had a small effect on her, though she still looked downtrodden. "I'm actually here to give you some other news," he told her, "which I hope is good news." Her look perked up a little in interest. "During my investigations, I discovered that your husband and his ancestors have accumulated a large area of land surrounding the town." He took out his map from his case and placed it on the table to show her. She marvelled at the notes and scribbles that she could not fathom. The inspector took his pen and indicated all the areas about the copse he had discovered to be the property of the missing Sergeant Banks. "He owns all this? Well, that's almost the whole copse," she cried in shock. "What's he done buying all that?" she asked him. "Well, that is the question. As I say, it has been in his family many years, centuries. There is a good chance that he was not even aware that he owned most of it," the inspector told her. "Well, what am I supposed to do with it?" she asked, a little worried. "I can't look after all that. I wouldn't know where to start. What would I do with it?" "Indeed. Well, I have been instructed to make you an offer," the inspector told her. "Up to you completely, but under the circumstances, what with the owner missing and the land being overgrown and underused, it has been suggested that the land be donated to the National Trust. They will then tend to it, it will be managed and accessible, and open to the public once more," he advised. "Well, I don't know. This is all rather a shock," she told him, looking a little red in the face. "Yes, of course, I understand." He took out his notebook and tore out a piece of paper for her. "Here is a number of a lady that you can talk to, if you want to, once you have had a think about it." She accepted it and read the number over and over again. "There is no pressure, the choice is yours," he told her reassuringly. "Speak to your son. I'm sure he will help you make up your mind." "Well, I will consider it," she nodded. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, out of habit. "A kind offer, but I'm afraid my visit today will need to remain short." He stood to leave, and she showed him out. "Thank you, Inspector," she said at the threshold. "Thank you for exposing my husband. You've set me free in a way, you know. I thought when he went missing it would be a bad thing, but it isn't. Thank you." She was still dabbing tears, but the inspector saw that she cried them in mourning of her old life and in welcoming of her new one. "My dear Mrs. Banks, you are most welcome, and I assure you the pleasure was all mine." He shook her hand and stepped outside into the sunny afternoon. "I will be in touch when I find him," he told her, tipping his hat and going on his way. He walked back to town, enjoying the sunshine and the warm air. The trees about him danced in the breeze, sun dappled and dashed between them. The red hue of the leaves littered on the ground made the copse shine warmly, and as he approached the town the inspector felt his walk was over before he had the chance to fully enjoy it. He headed down the hill, heading straight for the roundabout and the scene of the Firestone's removal. He was pleased to see it deserted. Nobody paid any mind to the site any more. All that remained of the previous day's activities was a small grassless dip where the Firestone had once stood. The hole had been refilled, grass would eventually grow over the dip, and the episode would pass into Firestone's arcane history. He stood by the remains of the scene and took his instrument from his case, stalking about as he had a few days earlier. The dial did not shift. The energy had dissipated. He noted the results in his little notebook, then took his camera from his bag and began taking pictures. When he was quite satisfied, he walked along the road that headed to the parade of shops that the residents called their town. He almost immediately bumped into Bill, who was in the company of a middle-aged couple pushing a pram. "Inspector!" Bill called excitedly. "Oh, good afternoon, Bill. How are things?" They stood and shook hands, exchanging smiles. "Fine, Inspector. Yes, very good. This is my, what are you again, my dear?" Bill asked the young lady that accompanied him. "I'm your cousin's niece, though I'm not sure what that actually makes us," she replied with a laugh. "Well, anyway, this is Gloria and Humphrey. I wrote to my cousin, just like you suggested, but it turns out that she died a while back. Gloria and Humphrey here live in her house now, so they got the letter and came up to see me." "Well, that is good news," the inspector replied. "Oh, I am so sorry to hear about your aunt." He turned politely to Gloria. "Oh, thank you, Inspector," Gloria replied gratefully. "Have you been to Bill's house?" the inspector asked leadingly. if a little guardedly, looking to Bill to try and gauge how much his newfound relatives knew of the house hid in the trees. "Yes, well, Humphrey thinks we should try and open it up, don't you, mate?" Bill turned to his newly discovered relative. "Well, what with the discovery of the stones, I think there's going to be a great demand for accommodation in Firestone." Humphrey spoke enthusiastically and confidently. "It will take some work, but I think we owe it to the old place to get it fixed up, see if we can open it as a hotel." "Oh, that would be wonderful. Such a beautiful old place. So full of history," the inspector enthused, genuinely pleased to see Bill so happy and to hear of his plans. "Yes, we might even make a few quid out of it if we're lucky," he laughed. "We're just going to the Green Man for lunch if you'd like to join us," Humphrey asked. "I believe it's partly down to you that we are here. It would be nice to thank you properly." "Oh, well, that is very kind, but I have a prior engagement I must attend to." The inspector thanked them with a smile. "You may want to pay a visit to the vicar next week. We discovered a relic of your family history in the graveyard." "My goodness," Bill cried, surprised. "Well, we'll get up there and see him," he told him, intrigued. "Well, I'll tell him to expect you," the inspector replied, pleased to have seen them. "I'm afraid I must be off. Enjoy your meals. The lamb is very good," he suggested. They went their separate ways, and the inspector continued on through town. The streets busied as he approached the shops. News of the stones had spread, so the townspeople had come out to investigate them. Visitors from neighbouring towns had also descended upon Firestone, and a few of the shops had opened to make the most of the opportunity. The inspector continued on down the road, nodding respectfully at Ivy Cole, who was in deep conversation with a gaggle of her pensioner friends. Ivy nodded curtly back before they continued with their discussion. He walked in the sunshine through the busy streets, up the hill, out of the town past the vicarage, and to the site of the stones. The two policemen were stood on the entrance as usual, and the crowd of people around them had grown significantly. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he said as he approached. "Oh, good afternoon, Inspector," they replied, and the men all exchanged respectful handshakes. "All well here, I hope?" the inspector asked. "Yes. Good work on finding Atkins and the others last night," the older constable congratulated him. "Good to have them all back, sir, thank you." "Well, not quite all. Banks managed to evade us once again," the inspector told them. "Well, he'll turn up eventually," the constable replied. The inspector wondered at just how prophetic his words would be. "Well, let's hope so. I'm just going to look around. Is that all right?" "Yes, of course. Up you go." They stood to one side, and he continued on his way up the path. As he walked, he surreptitiously removed his device and began casually taking readings. The needle hovered over 0, steadfast and unmoving. He continued around the stones, but the needle didn't move. Pleased with his result, he replaced the machine back in his bag. He made a few notes in his notebook before mingling around the soldiers and the stones. He took pictures and studied the space between the monoliths that had been his and Drew's focus of attention a few hours earlier. He noticed a few of Sanson's colleagues moving about between the trees and made his way over to them. "Ah, Inspector," Simon called to him as he approached. "Good morning, Doctor. How goes it?" the inspector asked as they shook hands. The trees had lost their feeling of foreboding. The shapes and the shadows had disappeared. "Very well, yes. The more of the copse we cut back, the more stones we find," he replied merrily. "Charles predicted you might find more. I wonder if he expected such an expansive site," the inspector pondered. "Come in here and have a look," Sampson suggested, and the inspector followed him into the trees to the object of his excitement. A huge stone lay on its side, surrounded by digging men. "We think it's one of the monoliths, knocked over and out of position, but we don't know from whereabouts exactly. To find out, we'll require a lot more digging," he told the inspector excitedly. "We're going to take a leaf out of your book and try to restore it to its original position. We'll have to clear some of this back, obviously, to make it easier to get to." He motioned to the trees. "Any chance of borrowing your army men for a while longer?" Sampson asked the inspector hopefully. "No, I'm afraid not," he answered simply but friendly. "This will be their last day at the site, so use them wisely." Simon smiled off his disappointment as he wondered at how long it would take without the inspector's help. "When can you open up to the public?" the inspector asked. "We need to get the area certified as safe. I've got a man coming over in the morning to have a look. Usually takes ages to get someone out, but he bloody jumped at the chance, as you might imagine. As soon as we get the all clear we can let them up, but we won't be able to open it at all at first," he explained. "No, of course, but the sooner the better, I think, don't you?" the inspector asked. "Rather," his excited friend agreed. "I also have this for you." The inspector reached into his case and removed a folder. Dr. Sampson opened it. "Oh, my photographs!" He began studying them, fascinated. "Thank you. I have also added a few of the pictures I took to help record the moment." A few carefully selected photographs had been added to the file, and the doctor admired them appreciatively. "Well, that is kind," he enthused. "No problem. Sterling work here. Well done." The inspector congratulated him with a pat on the shoulder. "After I've gone, I want to be kept up to date with any and all new discoveries, whether they are stone or otherwise," he advised him. "Of course. How do I get hold of you?" Sampson asked. "Go to Firestone Police Station and inform Constable Gates. He'll be able to let me know," the inspector told him. "Right you are, Inspector." Simon nodded. The inspector took one last look about the trees. The space between them felt lighter now. It wasn't just because of the sun that shone through the branches, alighting on the fallen leaves and brushing the wood with a rusty hue of red and brown. The space was airier. The trees no longer felt close. The sun's warmth brought with it the scent of drying wood and warming foliage, which lilted ruefully across the air. Wonderful, the inspector sighed, turning back to Dr. Sampson. Best of luck with it all. He bid him good day, and made his way back out of the trees to the stones, where he found the Major. "Inspector!" He nodded respectfully in welcome. "Good afternoon, Major. How are you and the men?" he asked politely. "All well, thank you. A bit of sunshine always helps lift the spirits a little. We have most of the earth shifted now. A few more days I think we'll have it all cleared," he told him efficiently. "Marvellous. I must thank you and your men for all your hard work this week," the inspector informed him gratefully. "Not the sort of thing you would usually find yourself doing, I imagine." "That is true, but the men have enjoyed themselves. It's been good to use their skills for something rewarding." The Major looked about him at the men, and at all they had achieved. "Well, as the mound is practically cleared, and that was what I asked you to help me with, we can safely call today your last day on the job," the inspector informed him. "Understood," the Major told him. "Good to work with you, Inspector." He offered his hand, and the inspector shook it. "And you, Major, you run a tight ship." "Thank you, sir," the Major nodded appreciatively. The inspector took in the impressive sight of the stones for the last time, before leaving the Major and stumping back down the path to the road, then along to the vicarage. Chapter 98. Aldous paced around his cottage nervously. He was already dressed in his black shirt, black trousers and white collar from the morning service. He checked his telephone every few minutes to ensure it was still working, in case anyone was trying to call and couldn't get through. He paced, he glanced out of windows, and generally found himself completely incapable of relaxing. For all the years he had lived quietly in Firestone, the last week had been the most eventful he and the town had ever seen. He paced to the back door and looked out, still barely able to perceive the massive changes that had taken place. Thanks to his own efforts and the efforts of the army men, the trees at the end of the graveyard were now fully cut back, revealing a space 3 times what had previously been accessible. The earth had been dug, the trees had been chopped, and gradually the space had been rescued from the copse. As per the inspector's instructions, the soldiers had dug a grave at the bottom of the graveyard where Aldous had instructed them, and it was this hole that caused Aldous to pace many miles from room to room in anticipation. He was waiting for the arrival of the man that had caused such upheaval in his life and in the village of Firestone Copse. He checked his watch for the 100th time that day, 2:30. Finally came the sound he had been anticipating, 3 short, sharp knocks on his front door. He rushed to open it. "Afternoon, Aldous," the inspector greeted him with a tip of his hat and reached out a hand for him to shake. "Good afternoon, Inspector. So good to see you." Aldous shook his hand warmly. "I'll put my coat on and show you around the graveyard, shall I?" he suggested eagerly. "If you like, yes, it would be good to see it." The inspector indulged the vicar and allowed him to give him the full tour. Aldous led the way around the side of the vicarage to the graveyard, where all the hard work was displayed in its full glory. "My word," the inspector exclaimed, "there's so much more of it than I had pictured." "Yes, it's rather impressive, isn't it?" the vicar replied without a hint of modesty and wearing a proud smile. "Can we take a look at the tomb?" the inspector asked. "Yes, of course. It's actually quite a feature, isn't it?" Aldous hobbled over to it, and the inspector politely followed. "I spent most of this morning clearing moss off of it, and it's quite a sight now." Piles of fallen moss lay about the dark-walled building. "Yes." The inspector approached the door and peered as best he could inside the dark, but the room was not giving away any secrets. He tried the stone door with a tough shoulder budge, but it was immovable. "Shame," he muttered, then stalked around it. "I saw Bill in town, told him about it. He may be up to see you soon." "Oh, really?" "Haven't seen Bill for a while," Aldous told him. "Nice chap," the inspector told him. "I'm sure the two of you will get along famously. Could we look at the stone wall?" he asked, nodding towards the back of the graveyard. "Yes, of course," the vicar replied, and they made their way through the crooked stones over the askew ground. "I've been out here every moment I could, studying the gravestones, trying to clear the moss off them a bit." "I can see you've been working hard," the inspector replied, impressed. They reached the wall, and the inspector removed his instrument from his bag, but once again there was no reading. He looked about the trees. The space was more open. It was as though the trees were breathing a sigh of relief and retreating. Aldous eyed the contraption suspiciously, but politely didn't ask about it. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," came Drew's voice from behind them. They turned and saw Drew and Casey standing at the roadside public entrance to the graveyard. Both were dressed smartly in black. Drew wore his best suit. Casey had managed to find a modest black dress and a pair of high heels. Her arm was interlinked with his casually, as if somehow it belonged there. "Ah, good afternoon," the inspector called in reply. Drew and Casey made their way through the graveyard to them. Casey made traversing the ground look easy in her heels. "Aldous, this is a colleague of mine, Dr. Ward, the finest pathologist I've ever worked with." The inspector introduced them on their arrival. "Oh, I bet you said it to all the girls," Casey replied with a smile. "You can call me Casey, father." "Nice to meet you, Casey," Aldous said, and they shook hands. "And you, Aldous," she replied. The inspector made a few notes in his book and turned to face them properly. "What do you think then, Drew?" he asked. "Well, it's certainly changed a bit since I was last here," he admitted. "What was it like the last time you were here?" Casey asked, intrigued. "Well, a few days ago when I was last here, the trees extended right down almost to the path," Drew told her, pointing toward the vicarage. "Yes, well, the lads from the barracks have done a wonderful job," Aldous replied. "I'm started to clear some of these old stones off. Thought I'd try and restore the place a bit now the trees have gone." He looked into the copse. The winter sun was breaking through the branches and illuminating their interior. "I have to say, it's nice to have a change in the weather at last," Aldous spoke for them all. "Indeed it is," Drew agreed. "We should have Andy and Jim with us shortly," the inspector told them. "They'll be bringing the bodies along, then we can get started." As he spoke, they heard the familiar sound of the ambulance engine coming to a halt outside, and they made their way to the front of the vicarage. "Afternoon, Inspector," Andy called as he jumped down from the ambulance. He hurried up to him and they took turns to shake his hand. "Shame we must always see each other in such circumstances." "Yes, such is our lot, I suppose," the inspector replied. "I presume our friends are in the ambulance?" the inspector asked. "Yes, they're in the back," Andy told him, and they made their way round to the doors at the back of the ambulance. Jim threw them open, and inside were a pile of cardboard boxes of various sizes. "Would you mind helping us move them to the grave?" the inspector asked Andy. "Of course not, we don't mind, do we, Jim?" Jim gave a quick shake of the head, and they all picked up a few boxes each. When they reached the grave, Drew climbed down, and they passed their boxes down to him. He put them down carefully and respectfully on the wet, slippery mud in a neat pile. When all the boxes had been successfully moved, Jim and Andy helped Drew out of the grave again. They then bid them farewell, and they made their way back to the ambulance. Casey, Drew, the inspector and Aldous then stood over the hole looking solemnly down at the boxes. The sun still hung gloriously over their heads, giving warmth to the chilly air. The breeze swayed the trees in unison, the branches waved freely around them. The vicar gave a cough. "Though we have no connection to the individuals we are burying here today, I have a feeling, like I do at any funeral, that I am in some way experiencing something." He paused, tried to find the words to express what he was feeling. For once, his words at a graveside were unrehearsed. "We are witnesses to the passing of someone from this place to another. Whether you believe that place to be the Christian idea of heaven, or the Valhalla of the Vikings, or whatever you might believe, there is still a passing. A change has occurred, and the world is different because of it. When these poor souls passed, they were mourned, but they could not be put to rest. Their relatives can't be here to see this day, to experience the passing, so we must witness it for them. The responsibility has passed to us, and so it is that we have all been brought here together today to complete their passing, and so we inter them once more to the soil." He paused, thoughtful, pensive. "And so, whatever we may believe, we hope and pray that these poor souls can find peace, as we return them to the soil from whence they came, and return ashes to ashes, dust to dust." He picked up a handful of soil from the pile and threw it over the boxes, and the others all followed in turn, each throwing a handful of soil over those that had passed, so aiding their passing. After a few moments' contemplation, the inspector picked up one of the spades and began to fill the grave with dirt. Drew then took a spade and helped. Casey moved round to stand with the vicar, linking her arm inside his. As the grave filled, the sun slowly set, and by the time the mound of earth had gone and the hole had been filled, the sky had faded to twilight, and the men were worn out from their efforts. They retired inside, and the kettle was quickly boiled, and they all enjoyed a hot cup of tea that helped banish the cold. As they warmed up, the inspector noticed the time. "Shall we relocate to the Green Man?" he suggested. "I believe Her Majesty owes you all a hearty meal in reflection of the effort you have all put into this case." They all agreed, and so took a slow walk down into the town and to the Green Man. They arrived to find the main bar alive with townspeople excitedly contemplating the stones, all exchanging tales and wonder. The inspector approached the bar, nodding to those that noticed him. "I believe there's a table booked for my guests and I," the inspector asked Lionel. "Of course." He stood from his stool and began rubbing his hands together in glee. "Go on through to the lounge bar, there's a table set up for you in there," he told them. They made their way through, and found Sergeant Frank Gates and Chief Constable Fairclough were sitting together at a large table. "Ah, gentlemen, I am so glad you could make it." The inspector shook hands with them and took a seat. "Thank you for the invite, Inspector, and well done for finding our missing men." Fairclough shook his hand determinedly, impressed. There were other parties in the lounge bar enjoying a quiet drink, and a few turned to watch the inspector's party arrive. The inspector nodded respectfully to them, conscious that he was disturbing their peace again. Mavis appeared and served them drinks and took more orders, and while they waited for their food they enjoyed a relaxed chat. "What are your plans now then, Inspector?" Aldous asked him when he could get a word in. "How long will you be staying in Firestone?" The inspector checked his watch. "Approximately 14 hours, the inspector replied humorously. A low chuckle echoed around the table. "My train departs at 7:30 tomorrow morning." "Leaving so soon?" Aldous asked, failing to hide his disappointment when he realised he was serious. "Does this mean the discovery of the man in the copse has been solved?" Drew had also been slightly taken aback by the announcement of the sudden exit, but did well to hide it. "Well, the case has not been solved. However, I have extinguished all leads that Firestone afforded," the inspector informed the captivated table. "Tomorrow I will be moving onwards with the case, following up a lead on our missing Sergeant Banks," he informed them. Drew raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What are your plans, Casey?" the inspector asked. "When are you heading back to London?" "Well, I thought it best I work from here and send my results back," Casey told him a little shyly. Drew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the inspector deduced the situation with a wry smile. "I see. A wise move. Good decision," the inspector informed her, and took it no further. Their meal soon arrived, and they all tucked in fitfully. "I'm sorry to be enjoying this land for the last time," the inspector informed them as he tucked in heartfully. With their meals thoroughly devoured, members of the party began to drift between the table and the bar as they relaxed. Drew left Casey chatting to the inspector and made his way over to an empty seat next to his uncle. "Evening, Drew." He looked up from the remains of his pipe and welcomed Drew over with a smile. "Evening, Frank. Shame to see him go, don't you think?" Drew asked. "Yes, well, he's got a job to do, you know," Frank reminded him. Drew nodded. "Casey looks like a bit of all right." He nodded towards her. "Well done, mate." Drew laughed. "Yes, she's a surprise out of all this. She's staying on, but she doesn't have to," Drew informed Frank. "I see," Frank nodded. "You think it's serious, then?" he asked. "It could be, but we'll see how it goes. She's still got her room at the Swan and Dove. It's not as if she's moving in just yet." Drew smiled. "No, she's probably waiting for you to tidy up first," Frank joked. He took a swig from his beer. "Look, there's something else I need to talk to you about," Frank told him quietly. He glanced over to the inspector and Casey to make sure he was distracted. "The inspector's been speaking to Fairclough, and there's talk of making you sergeant over at Firestone." Drew gawped. "Really?" Drew cried. "How do you know?" "Fairclough told me. Asked me if I thought you were up for it," Drew smiled. "And what did you say?" he asked knowingly. Frank shook his head. "What do you think I said?" he laughed. "Not the inspector needs telling," he pointed out. A bell suddenly sounded out from the bar area. "Last orders, please," Lionel yelled regrettably over the ruckus. "Keep it quiet though, all right?" he asked. "Look surprised when he tells you." Drew shook his head with a laugh. "All right," he agreed, wondering if he could lie to the inspector. "Do you want another one?" Frank asked, standing up with his empty glass to make for the bar. Drew was watching Casey stretch her arms high with a charmingly small yawn. The inspector was standing and saying good-night to the vicar. "No, I think we're heading off," Drew replied. "I've got an early start in the morning." "Right you are," Frank said, and headed to the bar before it got too crowded. The inspector and Casey appeared, and Drew stood. "Can we head off, Drew?" Casey asked. "I'm knackered." "Yes, me too." Drew put on his coat. "Are you off to bed, Inspector?" "Yes. We have an early start tomorrow. First train to Swindon," the inspector reminded him. "Swindon?" Drew thought for a moment. "The lead on Banks?" he asked, a little confused. "Yes, Mr. Barrow's hometown of all places." The inspector nodded. "I'll come through to the bar with you and say goodbye to Frank and Stuart." The inspector told him to change the subject. Drew led the way, and at the bar they found Fairclough at the end of an anecdote of his policing career, charming a few locals with his storytelling. Frank listened to him retell a story he had heard at least a dozen times, while he waited for his pint. "So I sneak in, and I see the bed," Fairclough was saying, whiskey in hand, "and I know it's just sheets under the covers to make it look like a person, but I can't let on that I know. I have to get into bed and cuddle up to it, and let the bugger escape." They all laughed raucously, even Frank, who still found it funny. They caught him in reception red-handed. This caused more merriment, and for a moment the bar was alive with laughter. "Ah, Inspector," Fairclough welcomed him when he had his breath back. "Can I get you a drink?" "A kind offer, but I have an early start, so I'll be turning in now," he declined politely. "Well, I could bid you good evening, then." Fairclough shook his hand warmly. "Thank you again for returning the men. It was impressive to see someone from the yard at work." "My pleasure, Chief Constable," the inspector replied. "It will be goodbye to you as well then, Sergeant." The inspector reached a hand out to Sergeant Frank Gates. "Oh, goodbye, Inspector." Frank nodded and shook his hand, passing on an unspoken respect to the inspector. They all said their good nights and went their separate ways. The inspector then returned to his room, quickly writing up the last of his reports before turning in for the night. Monday the 10th of November, 1969. Chapter 99. Drew arrived at the Green Man at 6:45 promptly the next day to collect the inspector. He had declined Casey's offer of cooking him breakfast, letting her have longer in bed. He found the inspector sat alone in the bar area at his usual table, enjoying his breakfast. A second breakfast had been laid out for Drew, and so he took this opportunity to share one last meal with the inspector. "Morning, Drew," the inspector welcomed him when he had finished his mouthful. "Morning, Inspector. What activities do you have planned for us today?" he asked, smiling. "Oh, I've an easy day for you today," the inspector smiled back. "One last trip as my personal chauffeur, and your life can return to some kind of normality." "Almost seems a shame," Drew admitted. "I think I'm actually going to miss working with you." "Well, the case is by no means closed," the inspector reminded him. "We still have the case of the missing banks, and I do not doubt for a second that more remains will be found in the trees. I am glad Casey decided to stay. It would be good to have her on hand as the archaeologist's exposure of the copse continues," he explained. "I have some other news," the inspector told him proudly. "Oh yes, what's that?" Drew asked. "Well, there is of course the matter of your promotion." The inspector took a swig of tea. Drew let a smile spread across his face. "Actually, I spoke to Frank last night, and he said he had been talking to the chief constable. He told me about the sergeant's position at Firestone and seemed to think I was assured the position." "Did he? I do so like it when people don't keep secrets. Makes our jobs easier, don't you think?" He was serious but smiling, as if he had predicted that this would happen, as if he wanted the uncle to tell the nephew the good news. "Well, he didn't quite get the whole story, so perhaps I should fill you in," the inspector suggested. "You want me to come and work for you?" Drew guessed. The inspector opened his mouth to speak, but stopped to smile at Drew's intuition. "Good guess, and the answer is yes and no. Her Majesty's government, at my recommendation, are offering you a job." "The job of sergeant in Firestone?" Drew guessed again. "Well, yes and no," the inspector replied again. "How so?" Drew asked. "Well, I think you'll agree that over the last week we have revealed a lot about the sleepy little town of Firestone, and I feel we have really only scratched the surface. There is a lot more to discover. What we need is a watcher, somebody we can trust. Someone we can trust to keep a lookout for more bodies, more odd occurrences, and help us deal with them properly and quietly. We need someone to monitor the stones, to see if the gateway opens again, and see if anything or anyone comes through it," he told him seriously. "So initially, yes, you will be sergeant. Superficially, you will be sergeant." He took another swig of tea. The pub was empty and deadly quiet at this time of day. He thought to how busy it had been the night before. "However, you are now working for the Department of External Affairs. Your first post is here in Firestone to monitor activity. You'll still need to apply for the sergeant's post and take the necessary exams, but you are already well qualified for the position. We are not cheating anyone by giving you the job." He held up his cup in a toast. "Welcome to the team." They knocked their cups carefully together to toast Drew's new position and took the last swigs of their tea, their final breakfast together finished. "What shall I do?" Drew asked. The inspector could not help but laugh. It was a good question. "The right thing, Drew," he smiled. "Always do the right thing and you will be fine." Drew guessed this would have to do for now, so decided to follow the advice carefully. "Well, now you're part of the team, perhaps you'd do me one last service and deliver me back to the train station," the inspector asked. "Of course," Drew agreed, and pulled on his coat. The inspector's cases were ready by the table, and the two men left the empty bar quietly, the bill already settled. Drew lifted the case heavily into his car boot, his hot breath puffing clouds into the air. The roads were deserted this early, and the trip went quicker than Drew wanted it to. The sun broke over the bleak grey moors as they drove, slowly banishing the dark of the night and bringing the land to life with a palette of browns, greens, and yellows. They arrived at the station with plenty of time, and the day slowly ground into motion as people arrived for their train. Drew carried the heavy case up to the platform, and they stood waiting together with the other commuters in this cold, bleak morning. "Well, Drew, it would appear this is goodbye." The inspector held out his hand and Drew gratefully shook it. There were no words he could give to convey how much the inspector had changed his life over the last 7 days, nor what a difference he had brought to the lives of the residents of Firestone Copse. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked, trying not to sound too dramatic. "That depends on how well you handle things here, Sergeant. I will read all your reports. Contact will always be available if you need it, though it might not be with me. You will receive more guidance as time goes on." A whistle down the line announced the train's imminent arrival. "For now, certainly, this is farewell." They stood well back from the edge of the platform as the train steamed past them. The carriages clattered by, gradually shunting to an impressive halt. No doors opened, no one was stopping at Nettlewood that morning, but those awaiting its arrival began pulling wooden doors open and climbing on. The inspector opened the nearest door to him and went to pick up his case. "Help you with your luggage, sir?" a passing guard offered. "Oh, yes, please, my good man." The inspector agreed, and the guard hauled the case onto the train. He followed him on, and then turned to Drew with an outstretched hand. "Well, Drew, goodbye." "Yes, Inspector, safe trip." They shook hands again, and then the inspector made his way into the carriage and found a seat. He made himself comfortable, and in a few moments the whistle blew, and a great puff of smoke the train began to chuff slowly away from the station. Drew watched it chug down the line until it was completely out of view, and he found himself alone, looking down an empty track. He cast one look about him at the cold, leaf-strewn platforms before returning to his car and driving home to Firestone Copse. Hi, I'm Stephen Rick. Hopefully you recognise my voice from the last 29 episodes that I've created and that you've been listening to and hopefully enjoyed. I've come here to the real Firestone Copse on the Isle of Wight, where I got the name from for the story. Just to give a last message to you to say thank you for listening, thank you for watching. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. It's been a long time coming. I'm going to put all the descriptions about where you can purchase the book as usual down in the description below. And I hope you enjoyed this journey with me. Hope you enjoyed the story. Hope you enjoyed the book if you've bought it. Hope you've enjoyed listening. More things to come, more exciting projects on the go, more books, I hope, coming soon. So thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye.